we've been talking a little bit about like just getting started and going and picking it up along the way, using technique when it's necessary. But I would say, I don't know if this is a technique or just a strategy or what, but I do think that if you found yourself in a corner or you find yourself going off the rails, sometimes the best strategy is just to acknowledge it and not take it so seriously. Just be like, look at me, painted into a corner. Look at me going off track. This is just this just happens. This kind of stuff happens.
This is Way of the Artist with Brandon Colby Cook and Evan Schulte,
exploring the challenges of the creative call
so that you can claim your own path
and make your life a work of art.
All right, it's the start of a podcast. Welcome. Welcome.
It is the start of a podcast.
It
You're
is
right,
the start
Brandon.
of a podcast.
It is the start.
It is the beginning. We have begun. Well, this one is not so serious. We like to throw these in every now and then. Basically, just means that we cut the preliminary talk short and we said, let's just get into it. Let's talk. Let's figure out where we're going to go on the way there, which is something that every artist should do every now and then, you know? Just start writing the script, see where it takes you. I used to do this. This is actually how I started screenwriting, Evan. I used to just have a scene in mind and I start writing the scene and then I'd see where the scene took me. And if a story started to develop, that was a lot of how I kind of learned my chops in writing. And I find that to be useful. It's not always effective for finishing a script though, because I would often find that I'd hit that wonderful page 30 mark where you kind of set everything up and then you're like, I don't know where I'm going.
Yeah.
I need to go to the drawing board and actually start this. So there's a certain point where you kind of, I think you have to stop and go, okay, what are we actually doing here? What's actually going on? Like, this has been fun exploring, but I find that we do that on these episodes. We usually hit a point where we go, I think I know what we're talking about now. I think we've found a line that seems to be coming up.
Yeah.
Which, we don't know yet, but we'll see when it comes up.
No. And, I think that it's sometimes too, it's about like, like for today, for instance, for transparency for everybody, I had like woke up, had a, nasty migraine this morning and, my 10-month-old didn't have a very good sleep, so it's like I'm a little tired, a little cranky, a little feeling a little bit off. And so sometimes those are it's not about fighting that kind of thing, and so sometimes those are the situations that lead to us doing these not so serious conversations where it's like, all right, well, let's just jump in. Let's not kind of agonize isn't the right word, because I never consider our preamble chats to be agonizing necessarily. Sometimes they drag at a certain point. I'll say that. Not usually, but every now and then I'm just like, okay, let's do something already. Let's just go now.
Yeah, it's like make a decision, because I think sometimes this is actually an interesting idea creative wise, right? You're brainstorming and you're trying out a bunch of different ideas and you're like, oh, we could go this way, we could go that way, this kind of lands to me, I kind of like that, whatever. There comes a point, I think, when we do our pre-talks where we're brainstorming a little bit about what we're going to talk about and what's going on in our life, and it's a combination of that. And usually on those days we come up with several ideas and it's kind of like, okay, let's just make a decision. We just got to go on one of these paths,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes it's like a situation like today where it's just, you've got what you've got and you're just like, all right, let's not beat around the bush. Let's just dive in and do something. And I think that can be a very valuable thing to learn to do, especially like if you are maybe a bit of an overthinker, over planner. There's a lot of usefulness to just seeing what you can do if you just allow yourself to just jump in.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like I that's something that I know I can fallen the trap of doing is spending too much time thinking about something. And I've often surprised myself by just jumping in and seeing like, oh wow, I can actually do more than I thought, just trial by fire. And so I think that's, in addition to it being a fantastic just sort of creative, even a creative exercise, because like you were saying, I've had the same experience where I've had some idea of writing a script. I had this one idea for a script years ago. It was something, I wanted to write something out of that, what's his name? Dov Simmons, school of filmmaking. I'm like, okay, I want to write a movie like a 70, like my whole idea was like a 70, 80 page script, a one location movie kind of thing, 2 characters, very sort of theatrical like script. And so I wrote the idea was essentially this sort of young guy, because I had intended to play one of the roles myself, was this youngerish guy in his 20s. This is when I wrote it. and you know, he wakes up, bag over his head, like in this empty room, and discovers that basically like somebody's hired this hit on him, kind of thing. And he's there with this hitman, and this hitman's basically just waiting for, you know, confirmation and for his cash to come through, type of a thing. And then there's some twists and turns that happen along the way. And so like I did have an idea of like where the whole thing ended, and I thought, okay, well, I know where it begins, I know where it ends, so I'm just gonna start writing it. And I don't know how far I got into it. I think I got maybe 18 pages into it, and suddenly I was just like, huh. Where do I go from here? I have no idea what happens next. What are they going to talk about? Because that was one thing where, because I had worked with you on stuff, I'd written some of my own stuff where I really did, you know, I figured out what all of these sort of the main guideposts for the movie was in the plot and what happens. And for this, I suddenly ran into this problem where I was like, oh yeah, this is because this only happens in like one location. There's just 2 characters, and the things like these major points have to be things that happen in the conversation. They have to be these, and what are those things going to be? And I didn't have any idea of what those things were going to be. And then suddenly I was just stuck. And I had no idea what to do with it from there. And that's where it ended up getting left at the time. And I never really felt compelled to revisit it. But yeah, that can be part of the problem. You know, it's like, okay, you're clipping along, you get 18 pages in, and then suddenly complete writer's block, complete creative block, because you haven't given yourself those sort of connection points, which for me is really, in terms of how I think I've written most effectively when I've written stuff, is that's what I need. Is I need those connection points. I don't need to know every single little detail of everything, but I need those main connectors, right? Okay, here's where we start, and then the next place it's got to get to is this part, right? And then it's got to get to this part, and then to this part, and this part, and this part, until finally it gets to the end. You know, it's like you got to set up all of these little sort of, I guess, little episodes that happen in the film. And I mean, you could probably speak to this a lot more effectively than I could, but as long as I have those, then I can do that kind of play and just dive in, because I know where I need to get to, and somehow you just find your way there. Mm-hmm. But if I don't have those things in place there at all, like if there's this huge gap between start to finish, there's lots of problems. So I think that what I'm really trying to say is I think that with some of those big things, those things that you really want to invest in, you want to set some things up. But if you're looking for just like a creative kind of exercise, there's a lot of value to be found in just jump in, just start writing, just start singing, just start playing something, just whatever it is, and without any expectation. And you can often find lots of interesting things. You probably won't have a whole thing. I won't say never, because I can imagine that there's probably some absolute masters in their field who it's so ingrained in them, a lot of these things, that they can probably just do it. But even then, even the greats, they still have a process that they follow, because they understand it's like, no, if I don't follow this process, then this thing won't happen for me. The magic won't appear for me unless I lay a little bit of framework, a little bit of groundwork for the magic to happen. But those jump in improvisations can often they can lend you pieces, I think, sometimes, but they very often won't give you like the full picture of what you need, but they can definitely give you pieces, creative pieces.
Well, this is a good example that you're bringing up, because I feel like it relates perfectly to a lot of what we're kind of venturing into today. Something that we often say is like, we harp a little bit in these conversations, I find, on technique, because I think we're always trying to encourage artists to not just be like, I got the silver bullet technique and now I know how to do this thing. And I think that, as true as that is, I do think that there's a certain point where technique becomes like, you kind of need it, because you need that structure. And I've had writers say to me, it's like, well, it's easy for you to say, Brandon, because you've already done this for 20 years. You already have this technique. You don't even know you're doing it half the time. So it's really easy for you to say, yeah, write organically. Which I think there's some truth to that, because it is accurate that, like, when I'm writing organically at this point, technique just kind of comes into play. But like, I'm very weary of saying that I'm a technical writer. I like learning techniques, but not techniques that like are silver bullets. I like techniques that get me out of a jam. So like, when I hear your script and I go, actually, this is a pretty interesting start. I'm actually curious, where does this go and how does it end? I actually want to know. So it's already piqued my interest. I'm sure some people listening might have been like, yeah, where does this go? I want to know. Like you said, you had an ending. I want to know what the ending is, right? Well, even if you think you know the ending could change. But like, the first technique that pops into my mind that would solve a lot of problems is like, what's the secret that we don't know yet that needs to be revealed? And maybe there's several that need to be revealed, because those one location stories, you're going to have a challenge, driving it by event, right? So you need like these internalized things to happen. And I love the technique of secret. I love it as a writer, and I actually love it as an actor, because having a secret, it just creates room for twist. It creates room for discovery. It creates room for rewatchability, because you're like, oh, that was going on. I didn't know that. Now I do. How interesting. Of course, that's why that happened earlier. And it gives you this like kind of interesting reward. And that's just one technique, right? I don't by any means call it the silver bullet, but it's a good one to be aware of, that you can use it at any time. Because when you're in a jam and you're like, fuck, I don't know how to get out of this corner I've painted myself into, you go, well, what if there was a secret going on, or what if there, and so then people often think when you write a story with a secret that you had that in mind. And although sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I'm just like, oh, but if like this was going on the whole time, but no one realized it, and then we just throw that in, it kind of gets us out of this jam. And if you do it in a way where it's not really like, it doesn't feel like cheating, which is like that ex machina type of thing. There's like hand of God comes in and just saves the day type of,
Mm.
if it's more like someone held their cards close to their chest and just didn't let it come out until like right about the point where the hitman's about to pull the trigger or do whatever, that person's like, yeah, but this, and then the person's like, fuck, and they can't do it. And then that lets the story carry on, because in the first 15 to 20 minutes, that person should probably have their head blown off, right? In a normal situation. But if we had some type of thing that prolongs their life, and then the rest of the movie, they're riding on this borrowed time, all of a sudden, boom, you got the middle of the movies beginning to flourish, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that technique might not ride you through the whole movie, but it might get you another 10, 20, 30 pages, or it might limp you through the 90 with just some more things that need to be added, right? But this is why I love it, because you started it from an exciting, interesting place. And I feel like so much of, particularly with writing, writers just won't start because they're like, yeah, but I don't know I don't know what to do. I don't know where I'm going to go. It's almost better, I think, just to get started and then get stuck at page 20 or 30 and then be like, and maybe you got to go back and redo a little work, but at least you kind of got things going. Because like with your idea, I mean, I'm sure there's other people, someone might hear this and go, I'm going to take that idea and run with it. By all means, I mean, I guess you shared it, so it's out there. But if you have a way to go with it, a lot of the time writers struggle with coming up with a good story just because they don't have a good, interesting scenario, right? And that's the thing about writing, while I'm just on this topic, just I guess like a podcast or like a song or like anything. Sometimes you have like one good thing about it, but not enough to make it work. But that one good thing didn't go away just because you don't have it all. Like one good thing is one good thing. And sometimes you need several, I guess, but you have one good thing. You actually have one workable thing. So I feel like that's kind of like what we're doing today.
Yeah.
We're riding on this little one thing and it'll lead to something else, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
And to go back to some of what you were saying, as anyone who's listened to numerous of our episodes has probably heard at some point, we've talked about Meisner, which is an approach to acting that I'm a big fan of, and then I teach. And the guy who came up with this sort of technique approach, Sanford Meisner, he very famously said, at least in his circle or in the acting community, he said, acting is never about the technique. And I would, and when I say that, I extend that to anything in any art form, is it's never about the technique. And I think that's, and I just want to address this because you're saying like, oh yeah, we often harp on technique, and it's not really, I don't think it's really that we're harping on technique. The technique is a tool, right? That's all it is it's a tool that you may or you may not need or use depending on the situation, depending on what you're trying to do with it. That those things are always in service. And I think what I'm always really trying to communicate is that point is like, it's not about the technique. And I think that's a trap that a lot of artists fall into when they're learning about how to do what it is that they're doing. When they're learning all these techniques and tools, that becomes about it. It becomes about that thing. And then your voice, your creativity actually starts to disappear, right? And you become a sort of color by numbers artist, creator kind of a thing, which is to say that you're not really being an artist, you're not really being a creator to some extent. And I've just seen that happen so much, and I saw it happen to myself, where it was, oh, this scene isn't working. I need to really, play my objective harder in this scene or whatever. And then, it just wouldn't work and just wouldn't work and it just wouldn't work. No matter how much technique I was throwing at the problem, it wasn't working. And it's because like, well, yeah, it's because you're so in your performance, you're so busy worrying and thinking about all of these techniques that you're trying to use that you're not alive in the scene. You're so, and it's a big problem for actors. It's like, oh, I'm so in my head, and teachers scream at them, you're so in your head. And it's usually because actors are thinking so much about their technique.
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing, like actors are often thinking about a lot of other things too up on stage, like, oh, how do I look right now, and this and that and whatever. But I would say that the majority of trained actors, when they're in their heads, it's because they're thinking about their technique. It's because they're thinking about all of that shit that they had planned and written all over their scripts and whatever. And suddenly it's like you're toast. You're just totally fucked at that point, because you're not present. You're not listening anymore. You're not trusting that work that you did is gonna show up for you, which is one of the hardest jumps for an actor to take. But yeah,
let me say this. I wouldn't say you're fucked, but I get what you're pointing to. I think if you can recognize that you're in your head and you can snap out of it, you can save yourself. Mm-hmm. You can catch yourself going off the rails and then bring yourself back on and be like, holy shit, listen, just look what's happening. And then boom, and all of a sudden you can be back into it. But you have to have, I think when you're careening off course in whatever you're doing, you need to not freak out, and you just need to go back to like fundamentals, basics, things that will actually just get you back on track. It's kind of like if you're in a car and you hit ice and you start to lose control. The worst thing you can do is go, oh my God, I'm gonna fly off the course, I'm blah blah blah, whatever, I'm gonna hit the wall. Like the best thing you can possibly do is, if you start to lose control, is to focus on where you want to go, and focus on just accepting where you don't have control, and like I've hit ice before, and I remember like this one time I was going to this job I was doing, and I was turning onto the highway and I hit this patch, and I started sliding towards the median on the turn, and I'm like, okay, everything slowed down. I was just like, I'm hitting the wall. I just hit a point of acceptance. I'm gonna hit the wall. Like that's, at this point, I had no control. I was totally going towards it in that speed. And so what I did while I was doing that is I just stayed super calm, kind of put my wheels towards the turn I was trying to do. And I got closer and closer to the wall. This is probably all happening very fast, but to me, it was like, in these moments, it's like time slows down, and I could feel the wheels catch, and then they caught. And just before I hit the median, it picked back up, and I was able to carry on, and no one even knew. And I think that's kind of one thing to keep in mind when you're acting. You could be going off course and no one knows.
Yeah.
But if you can catch yourself before you hit that wall, no one will even recognize that you even lost control. They might be like, oh, that was kind of interesting how they, kind of almost, wobbled a little there. Like, but really you were just like, I'm fucking in my head. Right. But the audience doesn't know. You have to remember, the audience doesn't know, even when you're writing, when you're doing anything, they don't actually know what's going on for you. They're projecting and perceiving what they see. So if you lose control, as long as it's not for too long, people won't often catch it. They actually might even think it's a good thing. So, but you do have to, like, you do become, I would say, fucked when you refuse to let go of your technique and you keep defaulting back to it, and you won't just let yourself be like present and let that kind of go.
Yeah, I think certainly within acting and live performance like that, yeah, there are moments, particularly within theater, where sometimes it's almost imperceptible. Although there is one thing that I have noticed, like when two actors, or however many are up, but usually, when two actors are up on stage performing, this a sign that something awry is happening as an audience member is when you actually check out a little bit. You just sort of stop listening.
Yeah.
It's this weird thing. It's like when the actors stop listening to each other, like really listening to each other, as an audience member, we actually stop listening to what's going on.
I've noticed that. Yeah. I've noticed that.
It's an interesting thing because when you see two people really getting into something up on stage, it's fascinating. Like you're glued. But when there's no one's really talking to each other, no one's really listening to each other, that it has that interesting effect on the audience as well. So, but the thing is like you're completely right, is that you have an opportunity to get back into it, right? And it takes a pretty wise actor to figure that out. And the solution is quite simple, which is to pay attention to your partner. Like the listening is always the way out, and that's one of the first things, or one of the most important things I try to hammer at actors. Is that's your primary job as an actor. That's the primary thing that's going to drive your performance, is listening. And really really learning how to listen, which is also to be open and sensitive, and all these, like every kind of meaning that you might be able to derive from the word listen. So it's just training yourself to be more sensitive to that. But on the surface, we can just say listening is your primary job as an actor, which a lot of actors don't even really understand that. They don't really understand that, because if most actors really understood that, there'd be a lot more really truly amazing actors out there. But anyhow, I digress. If you're in trouble as an actor, that's when you just go, oh, just stop, slow down, right? And another thing that we've brought up before is and there's lots of stories of very seasoned veteran actors telling younger actors out there, it's like, if you don't know what you're doing, don't do anything, right? Like just stop, because otherwise what you're going to be tempted to do is you're going to be tempted to try and push something. You're going to be tempted to try and make something happen, force some emotion, and it's going to be awful. It's going to be terrible. No one's going to want to see that. I don't want to see that. You don't want to see that. The director doesn't want to see that. The audience doesn't want to see it. No one wants to see it. So just stop and listen. And if you can do that, then you're back in the game. And that's one of the beautiful things about that, which is that, yeah, like that's all it takes, is for you to actually just listen and truthfully respond to that next moment. And you're back in it, right? Which is why I think Meisner also compared acting, or he referred to acting as a high wire act, right? Like it's you can get right back into it, right? Like, but you still have there's this point of presence and awareness and attention that you have to have that requires a tremendous amount of skill and strength to a certain degree in order to maintain that kind of a thing, because of how easy it is to fall into our heads to try and force something to happen, to try and take this thing that we thought our performance was going to be, the idea of what we want our performance to be, and try and impose our will to make that happen upon what's going on. Like the temptation to do that is so strong, and to resist that temptation and to just like, okay, here, but it's a double-edged sword, because it's so easy to fall off, but it's so easy to get back into it at the same time.
Yeah, that's I think one thing is experience is such a valuable thing, because you just get used to where things kind of go wrong and how to, how to recalibrate and stuff. So for like newer actors and things like that, like you need to give yourself a bit of a break and like understand that you're learning, and experiences, it's valuable for that reason, and I think for those actors who are newer or anybody, I mean, if you're writing or making music or whatever you're doing, it's just get time doing it, do it and do it and do it, and like
Mm-hmm.
start to get a feel for that. Because, like I've driven a car, most since I was 16, and so I have a certain amount of experience of like just the feel of the vehicle, plus driving standard and also pushing vehicles, to their limits. You start to learn a little bit about like what's possible. So when you're out of control, you kind of know how to recapture control. You know what it feels like.
Mm.
Sorry, my little cat is trying to get in on this podcast, and I've been trying to communicate to him.
It's
while we're doing this.
podcast time, bud. It's podcast
He's
time.
usually pretty good, but he's you know,
He's all fired up for this one.
he's fired up. Well, anyway, so like my point is just like with what we're talking about, like one thing, if you're writing, it's good to just write dialogue scenes and not worry about what you're gonna make out of it, like as a story. Like just write a scene, pick a situation and write that scene out. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and one thing I found very effective and helpful for me as a writer was to write for actors to perform the scenes. And you just write a scene, and in some ways, if it's a good scene, it doesn't necessarily have to have the whole story around it for the scene to really work, right? You just need the right elements in the scene.
Yeah.
And there was a thing I used to go to when I was younger called the cold reading series. And what would happen is all these actors would get together, and writers, and people would just perform scenes like ice cold. So they would grab, each person would grab a set of sides, which are bits of the script, scenes from the script, and they would each be given a character, and then they would perform the scene, and it was ice cold. So you wouldn't even find out what the scene was about until you were like halfway into it, because you'd start saying the lines back and forth, and then you start to see what was going on, and you just listen and you'd respond. And it was really good. It really sharpens your acting chops. But writers would eventually, what would happen is after we worked through a lot of the big scenes that are commonly done in acting classes, people would start writing scenes and they would contribute them to the scene list. And so when a scene was pulled, you didn't always know what you were going to get, but it sometimes was a fresh new piece of work that no one had ever seen. So while you're actually doing it, it's truly ice cold, because you don't even know, like you've never seen it on a movie. It's not like, oh yeah, I'm in Jerry Maguire. Like it's not like you could pick it up at a certain point, right? Like you just, there's no way you would know, and no way the audience would know. But it helped me as a writer in a way, because I got to see actors perform scenes and then, work them out. And actually, Evan, while I'm thinking about it, I was in an acting class early on, and I had a teacher who really was encouraging me to write, because she's like, you have a real knack for this. You should really, think about writing like as a part of your career. And I always wrote up to that point just so I could make a movie or act, right? It was like writing was a very like it wasn't my interest. It was just doing it out of necessity. And so I remember I did a scene with or I wrote this scene and I gave it to a couple actors, and the actress, she remembered the lines like instantly, and the teacher was like, how did you do that? You remembered those lines so quickly. And she said, it's just written so naturally. She was like, this is just how I would speak. And so that's why, this little guy, hey buddy, come on.
It's all right. Charles
Yeah.
can contribute.
Yeah, he's active today. But no, so you get my point is that when you're writing, I mean, I feel like I'm just distracted here. But when you're writing for actors and you're just writing scenes and you're just trying to get the dialogue to work and you're not really focused so much on story structure and trying to make it work into something, you start to just learn how people speak, and then it makes you a good dialogue writer. And so
Mm-hmm.
something that basically what I'm pointing to is that sometimes you just got to do something, you know?
Yeah. And think of when you think of, at least in sort of North American or English language cinema, one of the most cited writers of dialogue, Quentin Tarantino, right? And so many of his scenes are just this very natural kind of dialogue. Although I would say like there's a naturalness, but there's also there's another quality that Tarantino it puts into his dialogue. But like he's not afraid to just meander a little bit. Like let the people just be people and have conversations that you might have with your friends, or something like a conversation you might have with your friends, or a conversation that you might overhear at a restaurant or something like that. And and that that's all purposeful still too, even though it's not necessarily driving the plot, right? Like that, a lot of his dialogue isn't necessarily driving the plot. It's building relationships. It's giving us an insight into the characters as an audience. And sometimes it's just entertaining. Sometimes it's just funny. What they're saying is funny, and it's just like, this is a fucking hilarious conversation.
Yeah.
Right. And even that fulfills a purpose as well. It's like there's something. I remember this was something that our old teacher Nathaniel said in one of our classes, which was, if you make the audience laugh right away, it's like you'll be endeared to them for the rest of the show, kind of a thing. Like it's a way of getting the audience to kind of like you, but not necessarily because your character is a likable person. You could play you could be playing a really atrocious person. You could be playing the villain. But if you make people laugh and then we kind of like you, and then we feel a little bit conflicted about the fact that we kind of like you, because of what you're doing is super shitty, but it's. So anyhow, this is all to say that, a lot of times that dialogue and like how Quentin Tarantino uses it, at least for me, or how, whether it's his intention or it's just a byproduct of something else that he's trying to do, that's one of the things, like when you look at something like Reservoir Dogs and that restaurant scene where they're having this
That's exactly what I was thinking about.
Yeah, this totally insane conversation about like a virgin and the tipping and like all of this stuff. Like these are all pretty unsavory characters for the most part. Like people that you really probably wouldn't want to know yourself, that you wouldn't really want to have an interaction with, have in your personal life. But you're sitting there and you're laughing at this conversation, and you kind of like these guys, and then it makes it so that what happens afterwards, you have some sort of a feeling about it. You feel sad about some of it. You feel, even though these are people that, like if you didn't see that side of them, if you didn't see that, just that human side of them, you'd kind of see a lot of stuff that happens to these characters, and you'd be like, well, who cares? You're kind of a piece of shit. So whatever, you got what's coming to you. I don't care. Right. But if you make me laugh, you connect me to your humanity to a certain degree. And then suddenly now it has meaning.
So, I would say that it doesn't have to be laugh. Although, like, if you do get someone to laugh, then that's a real win. I think in general, if you can do that in life, it's very disarming. But it's I was talking about this with a friend actually. I think it was last night we were talking about it, and we were talking about how with certain actors that we really warm up to, and he kind of used this term, which I thought was a good way to put it. It's like they're inviting. There's something about them that's inviting, and I think you can have a really dark, kind of ugly character, but somehow they're inviting you into their world and it feels almost welcoming. You know what I mean? Like you're like, "Oh, okay, I kind of get it. I kind of get where you're coming from." And like, it's not like there's something about it which is not I don't know, like it's I don't really know, like I don't know how to like necessarily decipher like what makes one thing inviting and something else not. But like when you look at Reservoir Dogs, I mean these characters are not really good people, but the whole world and these characters in it, they have a quality of being inviting. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
something about it that makes you like want to know about their world.
Yeah, there's just with what you're saying, what it says to me, or what I'm getting from it, is there's this fascination that we have. I mean, it's why so many criminal movies and shows get made. Like we're fascinated by the criminal element in our society. There's something very attractive and romantic about it. And these shows that like they allow us to kind of play in that world vicariously a little bit without us actually doing it, because the consequences of that world are massive. They're too big for for most people to want to have any dealings with it. But we want to have some kind of glimpse into that world. And I think that when these characters do something or say something that yeah, like it not necessarily makes us laugh, but something that helps us to connect to them, but like a laugh, a joke, or whatever is a simple way in which we feel like we can relate to them. And I think it helps us pull. It's like, oh, okay, maybe I'm not so apart from this person who is in a different world than me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like it's like a thread of connection that helps me to get into that place a little bit more deeply and allow me to explore that criminal fantasy for myself.
Yeah, and I mean I think Criminal is a good, like that Criminal World's a good example of it, because as much as we like those shows and as much as like obviously there's a big appeal for them, it's not just that too. It's like sometimes it's other characters or situations that it's just, I don't know, like a kind of a personality that you would like to be, like
Mm-hmm.
like I think it's uh Tony Scott Stark in who plays Iron Man, like the character. What's his
Oh
name?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um
Robert Downey Jr.,
Robert Downey
who
Jr.,
plays
but
Tony Stark. Yeah, Tony
Tony
Stark.
Stark.
Yeah.
Okay, so but Tony Stark is, I find, a very inviting character into the world of Iron Man, which is like, I'm probably not going to put on an Iron Man suit and go fly around. Like, it's probably not going to happen and save the world and do all this stuff. But, and also be this like billionaire, that tech genius. Like, that's just not going to be my life, most likely. So, um, it's interesting in the sense that there is like, there's kind of a, I don't know, like it's something about it where like there is something about, I think, cinema where it can bring us to places that we can only dream of going and only imagine going. But if it's taking itself too seriously, it almost undermines the whole idea of it. And I'm not saying there isn't a place for things to be taken really seriously, and like I think that there is some appeal for that. But if you look on the whole, I tend to find that the shows that work, they have a little bit of tongue in cheek somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
There's just a little bit of humor, a little bit of lightheartedness in it. And if you don't have that, there's something that just doesn't feel right. Like if you look at
Mm-hmm.
Terminator and Terminator 2, Terminator 1, they're both really good movies for sci-fi genre. Terminator 1 had a much darker, more serious tone. And 2 had a little bit more like tongue in cheek. And I think 2, when people talk about Terminator, they often talk about number 2
Mm-hmm.
because I think that number 2 was the one that hit it right on the target. Number 3 and 4 and like so on, they're a little like they weren't quite, they had it but not quite right. But 2, like it hit that genre. It was just like in the right perfect amount, and it had like if you think about the events of the story, it's very serious. Like this this thing is essentially coming after. It's a horrible enemy to have, and it's out there trying to kill you, and um and you're on the run, and it's very dangerous and all of this stuff. But there's this kind of like, I'll be back, like this
Mm-hmm.
kind of like little bit of a like banter, kind of fun kind of quality to it, which makes it magical. And I think I mean maybe we're a little bit off topic. I'm not really sure, but I think like when you're when you're doing what you're doing, I think it's always worthwhile to look for a little bit of play in everything, you know? To not like even if you're messing up and you're making a mistake, like don't take that so serious. Like just be like, oh yeah, like I'm messing up a little bit. Like let me kind of get back on course. You know what I mean? Like, but I think I've definitely had experiences where I've started to make a mistake and I've been like, oh man, I'm fucking up, you're fucking up. Like get your shit together. And it's like that's not really that energy. It's like an energy, you know?
Mm.
And maybe that's part of what we're talking about today is like there's something about because we've been talking a little bit about like just getting started and going and picking it up along the way, using technique when it's necessary. But I would say I don't know if this is a technique or just a strategy or what, but I do think that if you found yourself in a corner or you find yourself going off the rails, sometimes the best strategy is just to acknowledge it and not take it so seriously. Just be like, look at me, painted into a corner. Look at me going off track. This is just this just happens. This kind of stuff happens. And now I have the interesting challenge of either getting myself out of this corner or trying to get myself back on track, as opposed to being like, oh, I fucked up. I'm screwed. Everything's over, Because I do think that sometimes abandoning your work and abandoning your process just because things aren't going as planned is a mistake, you know?
Y-
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just because
I
things aren't starting out perfectly either, sometimes you just got to be like, okay, well, we started, so let's pick it up. Let's just try and get it together.
I think that what's perhaps emerging in some of this conversation is that kind of balance, I suppose. Like there's always this balance that you need in order to fulfill, well, I mean, fulfill's the wrong word, in order to create the greatest potential for your work, right? And like I feel like this is like the other side of this exploration where it's like, okay, well, you didn't set yourself up quite enough at the beginning, so now you found that you're running into some roadblocks, right? That some creative blocks that are hard to correct for in now that you've hit it. Not impossible, but challenging. And on the flip side, there is this thing of you can take this process so seriously, and in trying to control the creative process too seriously and too vigorously, you can lose that other element that we can maybe just call other, which for me is that mystery element. And a lot of people don't like that, but for me, I think I used to have an issue with that, but now it's something that I really love and have learned to embrace. It's actually what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to evoke or invoke, however you want to look at it. I'm trying to invoke that mysterious thing to show up for me creatively. And that's really what I use technique for. It's like my offering to a certain degree of to invoke this other element, this mystery element to come to the party and make something together. And if you become too serious, too rigid in the process, you don't leave any gaps for that thing to come in. And when that happens, I think that's where there can be a lot to be gained from just, okay, whatever. Let's just dive in and see what happens. Let's just go in and see what shows up. And just start without me having to think the whole thing through to the very end and see what happens. Because then, because I think that that's another way you can become blocked, which is, again, you whatever you're doing, you're throwing as much technique as you can at the thing, and it's not, there's just something that's not coming together with it. Right. And it's because it's that genuine creative spark that you haven't allowed room for because you've tried to use technique in place of that mysterious creative element. And technique can't do that. It can't add that special sauce necessarily to what you're doing. So you need to do something to break out of that rigid structure and let something kind of spontaneous land. And so just that's where I think diving in has so many advantages, where, again, it might not give you the whole picture. It doesn't necessarily, it won't necessarily give you everything you need to go from start to finish, but it can be the thing that gets you past the block as well, which is something I've never really thought about. At the start of this, it was like, oh, if you don't set yourself up beforehand enough, you'll hit those blocks. If you don't have enough sort of a process, a technique so that you give yourself a sense of where you're going, and give yourself a sort of some what's the word I'm looking for? Some landmarks, I guess, some landmarks along the way that you're going from one to the next and next. If you don't give yourself enough of those, you're going to get stuck. But at the same time, if you've given yourself too many, almost, right? Like if you think of it as being on a road trip, right? And you're going from, you're ultimately going from point A to point B, but along the way you're going through this place and this place and this place and this place. If you are planning, it's like, okay, we're going to stop here and here and here and here and here and here and here, here, and you've done that too much, it's just like, eventually you're like, oh my God, we're stopping every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, where there's, and there's no room for something unexpected to happen for these little things. When you're traveling, that's one of the best parts of traveling, is those unexpected things that happen, or those little restaurants, these little scenic spots that you just stumble upon, these people that you meet that you didn't know you were going to meet. And if you're too rigid, it's like, oh no, we've got to get here now, and we've got to get here. We've got this itinerary, and we've got to get here now, and here, and here, and here. You you don't have room for those things to happen, because like maybe there's this lifelong friend that's sitting right there, but no, I've got to get to the next spot to look at it, so I'm off. You don't have that conversation. You don't, whatever it is. I think it's the same way with the creative process as well. You can just technique yourself, throw too much technique, be too serious about that you don't, you haven't left room for that other thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that other thing. Isn't that it, huh? I mean, because like that, I mean, that's kind of,
it's less woo-woo. It's the least woo-woo term I can think of for it. That other thing. Hey everybody, this is Evan, and this episode is brought to you by my book. Yes, I recently released a book called The Actor's Awakening: Connecting Spirituality to Craft. Expand yourself as an actor and your craft through a spiritual perspective. Take a journey that will explore universal philosophies and insights to help you understand human nature in a profound way, and develop practices to take your work to another level. Again, that's The Actor's Awakening: Connecting Spirituality to Craft. Available on Kindle and paperback on Amazon. And as always, if you like the show, please subscribe.
it's kind of that, well, that other thing is kind of the magic in the bottle, right? It's like the, it's interesting, right? Because like you, with art, I find you need to be a little bit, you need to be a little bit open, and you need to let go of control, because these things that if these things go unexplored and you stay too on point, you end up kind of like, I know this with writing, it tends to happen. It's like by rote, it's like paint by numbers quality to it, where it's just like, okay, we went here, we went there, we went there. And like these moments of reprieve, these moments of distraction almost, they can be just so valuable in a storytelling medium where, I don't know, like it's this surprisingly interesting and informative side story that somehow seemingly still works and matters, I think there's a balance. You don't want to get too far off the point and too far off topic. You do got to kind of keep your focus, because when things meander too much and they get too off track, then you end up nowhere. So it's this kind of balancing act of like, I find that with the podcast is a balancing act, because like when we have conversations like this, there's points where I'm like, oh, we could go wander off there and let's explore this idea for a little bit. But then it's like, wait, what are we talking about here? What are we actually talking about? What is the point of any of this that we're actually trying to say? And and I think even now, I don't know if we've totally defined it, but it's been interesting kind of navigating this, right? It's like we started off a little bit with like, okay, well, just like, let's just get yourself started and trust that it's going to work out. And then we start to capture something. Okay, I kind of think we're kind of talking about this, we're kind of talking about that. And then something gets said and it's like, well, let's explore that a little bit. But does it relate to what we were just talking about a little while ago? And these are kind of questions you can ask yourself in your creative pursuits of things. Like I think with writing, where you can kind of go like, what am I ultimately trying to do here? And if you go and explore and write a scene that maybe doesn't, say, serve the main principal narrative, the main plot, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have a place. But sometimes you can just look at it and be like, you know what? This isn't necessary. Like later, and you just cut it. It doesn't hurt that you wrote it, but you might look back and be like, okay, well, maybe there's a better way to achieve this goal. Like, I don't know, like I a few months ago, I was reworking a script, and I'm going to get back to it. I just took a break, but the townsfolk, we've talked a bit about it. And when I reworked the first act, there was a bunch of little things that was like actually really, like I was really happy with the way it was written. And I'm like, how am I going to edit this? This is like, everything seems pretty good. And then I just tried to like look deeper and really ask hard questions. And I was like, well, could I accomplish this with less? Could I accomplish this in a different way? And so for example, just to give people a bit of context so they can understand what we're talking about here, in the context of this story, you have a bunch of kids, a group of young like university college kids who are going on a road trip. They're going to drive down to Mexico. They're going to celebrate for spring break, come back, and whatever. That's the plan. But along the way, they take a detour trying to help someone out, gets them caught in a scenario which turns out to be pretty ugly, and boom, you're into like this horror thriller type of movie, right? Um, the way that we set it up was these kids are coming through, we get introduced to them, and they meet this couple on the side of the road. The guy hits the woman, they stop to help her, they pick her up, drive her home, and she's kind of the lure distraction that leads them to this town. In the new version, I was like, because they have this beginning scene in the restaurant, which is kind of like Reservoir Dogs. It kind of has that quality to it, right? And I was like, I don't want to cut this scene. There's so much good stuff and so much important character development here that'd be a shame to just get rid of it. So when I was doing the rewrite, I was like, well, what if we just had the couple in the restaurant and it was happening like over there and they were not really involved with it. And then somehow through the interaction of they're still having their diner conversation, this whole interaction outside when they're leaving kind of starts to manifest itself. And then from the restaurant, we also cut a lot of pages because now they don't have to drive, see this on the side of the road, which is also a little bit randomly seeming anyway. And like it cut down from what was, I think, 10 or 15 pages to probably 10 or 7 pages. They literally cut it in half. And what you have now is just better writing because you have more going on at the same time, but it's not dominating. Like things are happening in the background and you feel that there's this life going on beyond the life that's going on. And, you got to look at it in terms of you're taking essentially two different things, combining them into one and making them work. And the point though is that like when we wrote the script, we wrote it this way that we did it and it works. It actually works the way it was. There's nothing wrong with it. But it's like through experience and whatever, I looked at it and I'm like, I need to cut pages and I need to do some new things and I need extra pages to do these new things. And it's the only way I'm going to accomplish this. So where do I cut and how do I cut? Through necessity, it's a better scene. It's just a better setup. It gets to the action quicker while still managing to maintain the magic that we kind of created in the initial draft. And I guess my point is that like the source material was there to work from, and the source material came out of, well, this is our idea and let's write that down and go with it. If the source material wasn't there, you would have nothing to rework. So like, I guess, as we're creating this podcast episode, right, when we do it this way, we're sharing a bit of the rough draft with everybody in the first quarter to first half of it. Sometimes the first 3 quarters are just a rough draft. And then we start to tie it together at some point. We start to go, wait a minute. Okay. You know what I mean? Like this is what we're talking about. And this keeps coming up and this seemed important. And this actually, we skip out what didn't seem so important. And in the end, it all kind of comes together. And so I'd say one last thing on all of this, Evan, as I know some people don't like this word, but actually the more I don't know, do life and the older I get, the more this word just seems to be such a good word, is the word faith. You got to have faith that it's going to work out. It's all going to come together. Just keep trucking along. Just keep being persistent. Just keep sticking at it. And you know what? Have faith that if you do that and you put that stuff in, that it will come together. It will add up. It will make sense. But if you don't do anything, that's faithless because you have no faith that anything's going to happen. But you got to have a little faith because persistence is like that. You just do something and you try and you work at it and it feels like nothing's happening and nothing's happening. We're getting nowhere and it just seems pointless and meandering. And then all of a sudden, but you've worked on it for a little bit and little bit, all of a sudden, all those little bits, they just start to add up and come together. And you're like, oh, look at this. This kind of sings. This kind of works. This kind of, comes together. But you gotta just put a little in And maybe you don't know what you're going to do with it. Maybe you don't know what it means. Maybe you don't know where it's going. But you do that little bit. You started out today, Evan, you had a migraine and you're like, but you're here, you're ready to record, and we're like, let's just get into it. But if you weren't here, we never would record and it wouldn't happen. And so it's not the ideal way to start, but we started, we pushed through, we work, and now we're here. You know what I mean? And I feel like something is blossoming out of this conversation. I don't necessarily know what it is. There's been some great things, but something good is coming out of this. And I have faith that it will all come together in the end anyway.
Well, I mean, I think that what you've been saying is really interesting, because I think that you are getting to what this conversation is about to a large degree, and everything that we've been talking about. Like, as you said, there's this process where I'm going to try, I have to try and say this in as concise a way as possible, because I got a few ideas that are coming up at once, and I know that they're connected, but trying to make that connection, we'll see how that goes. But I think that, like, from what you were saying, is I think that oftentimes it's that thing of like, we can stop seeing the forest for the trees, right? Which is, you brought up this question, and it's interesting that you said it, because I jotted it down quietly and then you said it, or something like it. But it's like, what is this really about, right? And I think that that's a really terrific question to check back in on when you're doing anything creatively. Like, what is this really about? Especially when you're in that place of, you're not seeing the forest for the trees anymore. Like, you're just trying to hammer away, and just going on a little bit of just a free form whatever. Like, what is this really about? Well, I don't know. Let's just explore. Let's just start rattling some stuff out there. Let's try and see what comes up. Are there any patterns? Are there some themes? Are there some things that is there a thread that's actually connecting all of these things that I've either haven't seen, or that I've forgotten, or something that you're just that slipped through somehow, and become aware of that. And maybe that will unlock whatever the solution is for you, whatever the answer is. But I think that, and you brought in this word faith, and this is the next point that I had, which is that if you have something that you've gone into just out of an interest or a curiosity, like a genuine curiosity, I think that has a lot to do with faith, because you don't often know if there's anything there. You don't often know if it's even worth going into necessarily. Like, if there's going to be any sort of pot of gold at the end of this rainbow, but you just go, but there's a rainbow. So I'm just going to go. I'm going to go and see if there's anything at the end of this one. You don't know. You don't necessarily know why something is interesting to you, why something is compelling to you, but by making that decision to go into it, I think that there's an element of just have some trust, have some faith in whatever that thing is. You don't necessarily know why it is, but it is. And through that kind of exploration, through that, like, going into it, you start to discover, oh, this is what this is all about. This is what this whole thing is about. But you don't know that until you do it, until you kind of just jump in and play with it and see if see what's there.
Yeah, it's really, that's so much about what this is about, is just having the faith that if you follow a curiosity or an interest, that it will lead somewhere, and that part of finding your way there is part of the it's part of the important thing. Like when I think of Tarantino as a writer, to me he's somebody who has an incredible faith in his ability to tell a story. And whatever you think of him is, it's irrelevant, because I think the thing is that he has a way of taking, like, dialogue, for example, going off on something and then coming back somehow to what matters. And I mean, I wouldn't say that I love it every time. He like I appreciate his work. He hasn't always been my favorite, and not everything he's done I've loved necessarily, but some stuff he's done I've really loved. Um, but I can respect the fact that, like, with dialogue and just his ability to kind of keep you engaged in a story and to tell a compelling story, you know, part of what makes his work so interesting is that it doesn't just follow some standardized thing. It's you kind of know when you see a Tarantino movie that you're probably, for the most part, going to be going on a little bit of an adventure. And if you think about that word adventure, kind of requires a little bit of faith, right? To be like, hey, like, we're gonna go venture, we're gonna go explore, we're gonna we're gonna obviously face some challenges and some obstacles potentially, most likely, and some things are not gonna go exactly as we planned, but you know, we might take a detour, and maybe it'll be out of necessity, or maybe it'll be out of pure choice, just because, hey, this would be interesting. Um, so, like, I think as we work through this episode, something that's kind of coming up for me is these type of episodes where we kind of just go, like, let's not take ourselves too seriously. Let's just get into a conversation and talk. I think one of the great benefits of these types of conversations has really been that we're going to take some detours. We're going to go down some roads. They might even be dead ends. We'll turn around, we'll come back, we'll figure it out. But we're going to find our way somewhere. But what we're going to do is we're just going to keep moving forward. We're going to keep moving in a direction that makes sense. And we're going to end up somewhere. And we're going to enjoy where we end up. We're just going to try to figure out where that is. And it will be interesting to us and to everybody. We'll give it that room. And I think there's a time and a place. I don't necessarily think that that's always the way to go. I think sometimes it's better to be a little more planned, a little more clear, to be like, hey, this is what we're doing today. This is what we're talking about. But I do think every once in a while, it's nice to have a little bit of that. Okay, let's walk out the front door and let's just go where our heart kind of leads us today, And, one thing I used to love about living in the city or even visiting cities, is that it's really good to have a day where you don't have a scheduled kind of plan, where you just go, today I'm going to walk down this area that I've never really walked down, and I'm going to look, and you end up doing things. You end up finding cafes you never knew existed. You end up meeting people you never would have met. You end up doing things or seeing things that just surprise you. And those things often inform and lead to new, other interesting discoveries and adventures. So I think another thing that's coming up, and I'll just throw this into the pot while I'm at it, is I do think that most of us are creatures of habit for the most part, because there's a certain amount of predictability and comfort that we want in our lives. And I think that we will, if you look at yourself, you probably will notice that you do a lot of the same things over and over and over again. You tend to sleep on the same side of the bed. You tend to take the same sock off, first, this, like, stuff like this. You just notice that you probably do a lot of stuff kind of the same way, put your shoes in the same spots, do the same things all the time. Or even if you misplace, you always lose your keys. You just always put them in around, but it's still consistent. You know what I mean? And so there's a habit pattern breaking thing that comes with exploratory stuff like this too, where you can kind of go, like, hey, like, maybe I can break away a little bit from how I always do things, and maybe you find something in that new adventure that you want to kind of incorporate and take back to your pattern, and you go, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this more.
Yeah. Well, that's because I mean that is how you move away from just falling into like the formulas. That's how you actually stand a chance at doing something that's actually original. Is you've got to be a little bit of I don't know, a kook to a certain degree. Like that's how that other thing comes in, because again, like the sort of, if you're too stuck on technique and things, you'll create a lot of things that are a lot like what a lot of other people do. Brandon,
Yeah.
you've probably heard this before, and we've been talking a lot about writing, but there's that old saying of like, write a movie that you would like to see. And I think that that's another way of really saying, like, write something that actually interests you, that actually really interests you. Because if you're not writing something that actually interests you, you've got no chance at that other thing coming in, right? That might just blow everybody's minds, like one of those people who does something and that and sets an entirely new trend, like instead of someone who follows one, but who actually sets something. And I think it comes out of that genuine curiosity, that genuine interest in something. Because I think that if you can stop, like as a writer, if you can take a look at what you're doing and maybe you are stuck at some point, and instead of trying to just throw some kind of arbitrary tool or technique at it, which, sometimes that can help you get unstuck, but also just asking yourself these questions: what is this really about? Or what would be interesting to me to happen now at this moment, right? And I very often, by asking yourself that question, I think that that's when all kinds of really, really interesting, cool things can happen, because we're actually just checking in with ourselves. We're not looking to some outside thing to give us the answer to how to do this. We're not looking for how someone else did it, how whatever. It's like, no. Forget all of that. What is interesting? What is compelling to you? What would be something that would be totally insane, amazing if you saw this, right? What would that thing be for you? And exploring into that thing, right? Trying on some different things. Next thing you know, you've got something that very often everyone else is going to find it the same way as well. But you only get to that by actually checking in with yourself, by really being able to pay attention to the things that are actually genuinely coming from you. I hope that made sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think so. I think so. I mean, I think there's the thing that I'm really taking away from what you're pointing out, and I think this is this is a worthwhile thing to just draw our attention to, is I like how you put standing a chance. I feel like that's such a accurate way to put it. It's like, if you want to stand a chance to actually do something meaningful and interesting and new, you have to get away from, this is how we do it, this is the way it's done, this is the way it's always been done,
Yeah.
like you really got to like go like, okay, well, let me break away a little bit. And I always encourage people when they're writing their screenplays to, if they have an inclination to go follow something, like pursue it, like look into it. I try to give people principles and rules, more principles. I don't like to think of them as rules, but like principles and kind of ethics to your writing, in the sense that you have kind of an understanding of why you're doing what you're doing, so that when you break away from it, you know what you're breaking away from. Because I think there can be a certain amount of defiance. Like if someone told me there's these rules and you have to follow these rules and do everything by the rules, I would probably end up being very defiant to them and be like, well, I want to break this rule and see if I can bend it. And I would challenge all the rules. That's just how I am. Because I'd always be testing to see if that rule is solid, if it actually means anything, or if it's a bunch of bullshit. Because like, to me, I don't like bullshit rules in life or in art or in anything. And there are many people who are out there like that. But I do like principles. I like it when someone says, this is why I suggest you do this. This is like the reasoning behind it, and this is what you're doing. And now if you don't do it, this is why I'm suggesting you maybe consider doing it, because if you don't do it, these are the consequences, these are the outcomes that can happen. Like people don't understand a lot of the time why you shouldn't do something. Like, for example, why you should be on time. A lot of people go, oh, it doesn't matter, whatever. It's just like, who cares, But being on time is such a fundamentally, principally important thing to do. And a lot of people go, well, like they just don't think it matters. But here's an example. If you show up late, that's something that you can control. And what you're telling that person, whether they acknowledge or not, whether they're consciously aware of it or not, is that you cannot be trusted over what you can control. And if you don't believe that you're in control of your time, then you become known as someone who isn't in control. And this becomes your character. So the reason why I say be on time, and I would always suggest that to everybody, do whatever you can to not only be on time, but be early, because it does a couple things for you. It shows people that you're the kind of person that controls your world, that is in control, that has a certain amount of power and prowess over their life. And for people who are out of control, it's a trust thing. If I can't even trust you to be on time, how can I trust you with like money and important things? And like, it's such a basic fucking thing. And if you can't be on time, why would anybody really trust you? And you don't know this because you're just saying, oh, I'm just a little late. Who cares? People are learning not to trust you, whether they will acknowledge that and say that directly or not. It is a clear act that you are untrustworthy. And people like, why you're looking at it way too serious. I'm just telling you, there's a consequence to these actions that you take or don't take. Mm-hmm. And so like, there are going to be times where, you're going to be late. Something's going to happen. It just doesn't work out. And people, when you're on time all the time, they will call, they will ask, they will go, what's going on? Are you okay? Is everything all right? People will care because they know you to be somebody who's in control, who is punctual, who's on time, who keeps their word. And when all of a sudden something happens, people are surprised by it. That's what you want. You want people to be like, holy shit, something's wrong. Because for some reason they weren't able to do what they normally always do. But if you're the person who's always late, people, that's just how they are, and people start to not care. They start to count on you not being in control. They actually will respond and take actions in accordance to you. And so people go, well, it doesn't matter. It does matter. And like, so when you're doing your art, there's principles, there's things that matter, and you should do them, and you should know why you should do them, and you should know why, if you don't do them, what the consequences are. And if you do, then you begin to understand that these little things make a big difference, especially when they all add up. Um, so there's little things that, you begin to incorporate into your process where you consistently stay true to them. Whereas other things, you might bend them. But like the one about and this is a little bit off topic with art, but it's the best example I have at the moment. This one about being late. It's a hard one for people to test for because you won't notice it until sometimes several meetings or several years into doing it. And then to repair the damage you caused by being late all the time is so difficult to do with that person or that organization or whatever, So like there's little principles that you should learn the value of why you do them and the value of what would happen if you didn't and like the consequences of that. And then there's things where it's like, let's just test this out. Let's just see, like if I try doing this thing, what might happen, just to kind of find out, But these are things where it's like, it's not a rule. It's just like you do it because you understand the value in doing it. And sometimes there's these things we do, and it's like you don't know the value of it. You just do it because someone told you to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think, you got to like go like, well, why am I following this rule or this guideline if I don't even know why I'm doing it? And then let me try and tie this back to art, Evan. You're doing your art and your teacher says, you need to do this, or someone says you need to do this, but you don't know why. Your number one investigation should be why. That should be, you should never, in my opinion, you should never feel afraid to ask why someone is asking you to do something, or why someone's suggesting you do something or telling you not to do something. You should always investigate why. Give me a reason. Help me understand the purpose, the meaning, and if their reason is because I want you to, because I told you to, because they want to control you, that's a shitty reason and you should maybe not do it. But if it's because there's some really good value behind it and it really makes sense and resonates with you, then you're going to be doing it out of ethic, out of purpose, out of a sense of, principle, right? And so I think like as we're going through this conversation, there are certain principles that we stay true to, but there are certain things where it's like, this is not a hard and fast rule. This is a flex area where it's like, if you want to go off a little bit off topic, that's okay. Let's do it a little bit. But eventually the principle is, let's try to bring it back to a point. Let's not just lose ourselves. Let's not just abandon everything. If we catch on to something, let's try to, tie it back in, because otherwise, like, why even follow or listen to this podcast? Why listen to this conversation, right? Like, you want some through line. You don't want to just be two guys randomly talking about nothing. Because you're here for some reason, even if it's just to hear our voices, like, I wouldn't be so bold as to say that's why you're here, but there are certain people where sometimes I just like to hear them talk, and that's interesting enough. But for the most part, I think people listen to something because they have a little bit of a reason of some sort. And if we're too random, if we're too chaotic, then it's like, maybe we can't deliver on what they're here for, right? And at the end of the day, I think we're trying to explore something. That's our goal. And if we're too chaotic, we explore nothing. So I think at the end of the day, the kind of the point is, what are we exploring here? I think that's really what we're always asking, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, sir, I feel like we should probably wrap this one up.
All right, sir.
So you're the only one with a beer today.
Okay, well, yeah, we took turns this week.
Yeah.
So, Evan, I'm having a beer, and you're not going to believe what kind of beer I'm having.
You having a sour?
Yeah.
You're drinking
never
a sour.
Have sours.
Wow.
I know. And I'm always like, there's only a few that I like. Which has always been really true. But this one's been great. It's been really good. I've really liked it. I always loved peach. So I knew that peach was already a winning element. And this is by Phillips Brewing. and Malting Co. And it's called the Dino Sour, Stone Fruit Sour. And it's delicious, man. It's like it's actually I could probably it's tame enough as a sour where I find it's like it's good, but it's kind of like having a fuzzy peach candy a little bit. And I could probably even have two of these beers, and I wouldn't be fed up with it. Because usually with a sour, I'm like, okay, one, and then I got to move on to something else if I even
Yeah.
have a sour. But this sour is, when I took my first sip, I was like, wow, this is really tasty, and it's good, not too overwhelming. I think they got a good balance with the sour and like just a tasty beer. It's a little bit like having a Bellini as well, but a little more sour. But if you like that kind of thing, I definitely recommend it. It was just it was one of those things. I got to try something different today.
I've seen that one around, and I've never tried it. So maybe next time I see it, I will give it the old college try.
Yeah, take a chance. It's good.
All right.
All right. Yep.
Well,
You got any final thoughts?
I don't know. I mean, I always enjoy these conversations because I find that they're in many ways the most surprising, often because they lead to some sort of unexpected awareness, because there's not necessarily an end goal to it. And I mean, I wouldn't say that even our conversations that we have where we have a sort of a direction, a topic that we're coming in with to discuss, because I very often find myself having a lot of new awarenesses around things that we know that we're talking about. But these ones, because we don't have necessarily that piece of direction, and we're just having an opportunity to just play and explore and see what comes out. It is in some ways more surprising when there's these things. And I think that in this one, what was interesting to me was how is this thing of how you can get stuck one way or the other. You can get stuck by being too freeform. You can get stuck by being too technical, which was probably the more surprising thing to me, which is that, when you get too technical, it's like you just outthink yourself in a way, to being able to, like make something truly artful. And that those questions of like, okay, well, what is this really all about? Or just even following however small of a thread it is of something that's like, well, that's kind of interesting, right? And just following that thread. Well, that's kind of interesting. And let's just go down that route. Let's just go and let's just go and see what's there, and how that can just open up all kinds of possibilities, and is that sort of inviting of that other thing, that other thing of just it's not rocket science, right? I think that's the thing. Sometimes they're just like, look, it's creativity and artistry is not rocket science. Yes, there are things that are important to plan and prepare for yourself, but you can shoot yourself in the foot just as easily with all of that. And that sometimes it's just the simplest questions that actually kind of right the ship. Right. It's actually, I'm seeing the thread now, like where we start with the whole acting thing. It's just like, don't do anything, right? Stop, listen, pay attention, stop trying to force this thing. Stop trying to will your way through this, or will your way to a solution. Just stop, listen, be quiet for a second, right? Okay. What is this really about? What is really interesting? What did I actually set out to do in the first place? Why was I interested in this thing in the first place? Like, what, connect to that, like, come back to the voice, come back to that voice that's inside of you, and give that thing an opportunity to, because it's been shoved off to the corner. You know, because it's like, okay, we're done with you. We're now into the business and the mechanics of it, right? I'm just like, no, don't ever shove it off in the corner. It's all about just integrating it. So come back to those simple questions, and I think that those are the things that we often lose sight of, and are the most important thing that we have to work at making sure that it's not lost.
Well, I really liked how you wrapped that up, man. That was nice, because it's making me feel an inspiration to get back into writing. And I think that one of the things I love about writing is finding myself in a corner and then figuring a way out of it. I feel like that's where the most creativity and the best stuff kind of comes out. And technique, I find, is often, I said this early on in the podcast, but I'll say it again, is often a response to trying to solve a problem that you find yourself in, where it's like, I could even imagine, not that I have a lot of experience with this, but I could even imagine if it was painting, the brush stroke you're using might not be accomplishing what you're trying to get, right? And so you might learn a new technique, and then you realize, oh, okay, hey, I can achieve this by doing it this way. And so I'm reminded of a screenplay I was writing very early on in my career. And I had read a bunch of screenwriting books at this point, one of them being Sid Field's screenplay, which was helpful. But I picked up Sid Field's other book called Sid Field's Problem Solver, something along those lines. And it gave me so many solutions. And I just reworked that script with that book. And I made so many notes. And it's one of the most important books I read, particularly because it was so useful for me, because it really just helped me solve a lot of problems and figure out solutions to things. And and I learned a lot of technique from it, but through direct application on an actual script. It wasn't like a casual read, like, oh, it's a good idea. Those are some nice things. It was like, shit, this works. Like, wow, this is really cool. Wow, this is so effective. Like, there's this one tool I'll just share just to give people context, because sometimes that's valuable, is there's this one thing he suggests called the circle of influence. And it was perfect for my script, which basically something happens earlier in that character's life, which creates a circle of influence in their life. It influences other things that happen. So in this particular story, this guy was kind of a teenager, and he was becoming a drug dealer, and he was kind of like, things were blossoming in his life that way. But his mom had died. His circle of influence, I decided, was his mom had died of an overdose, which really informed how he was about selling drugs, and his moral and ethical conflicts around that. Whereas like his buddy who was selling didn't care. And it created this really interesting character dynamic just because that had happened. But it was a technique I used to help me find the path to an interesting story development idea. And it's filled with tons of things like that. But I found that to be such an effective book. And I guess my point is, as we're wrapping up this conversation, is that whole thing of like, when you kind of just put yourself out there and try something, you end up inevitably with problems and challenges because you maybe didn't think it all out at first, but maybe that's exactly what you want. Like, this is the thing that I'm kind of thinking, is maybe you actually want to put yourself into challenging, problematic situations so that you can figure out how to solve them, because that's actually the point. Not to preemptively solve them so you never run into them, but actually to preemptively try to run into them, or dare not even know what you're going to run into, and then go like, okay, now I'm going to get creative about figuring this shit out I just put myself in. You know? So I think moving forward from this podcast, I'm going to kind of run with that, try it out creatively in my life, and just, play with that because it was actually such an important uh, period in my life as a screenwriter. It actually changed the game for me. Was I had a script, it wasn't quite working the way I wanted. I read this book, it helped me to start to solve those problems. It gave me some solutions, and then I applied them, and then I learned probably more about writing during that time with that script than probably really any other time in my career. So, yeah, I don't know if you're hearing that, if that lands with you, try it out. That's what I'll do as well.
Thank you for listening in on our conversation today. We hope you found something helpful that you can carry forward with you. Head over to our website, wayoftheartist.com, for more free exclusive material and learn about the show. If you haven't already, please support us by subscribing to the show, sharing it with people you know, and keeping compassionate, creative conversation going.